History is full of forgotten screams, stories buried so deep that even time refuses to remember them. Some events were never recorded properly, not because they were insignificant, but because they were too disturbing to explain. Tonight's story is one such case, an incident whispered among locals, erased from official records, and feared even decades later. What happened on that plantation was never meant to be uncovered, and yet the silence surrounding it is far more terrifying than any answer. In 1944, the idea that slavery could still exist in America sounded impossible on paper, yet in the rural outskirts of Natchez, the truth lived far from laws and headlines. The plantation economy had not truly died. It had merely changed its name. Formerly enslaved black men were trapped in cycles of debt, intimidation, and violence that bound them to the land as tightly as chains once had. Sharecropping contracts were written in language they could not read. Wages were withheld for invented expenses, and leaving without permission was treated as theft of labor. The plantation owners enforced their own rules, isolated from federal oversight, knowing that local authorities often sided with wealth and tradition rather than justice. This particular sugarcane plantation was known among workers as a place you entered but rarely escaped. Armed overseers patrolled the fields, watching not just for laziness but for any sign of resistance. Cane cutting was brutal labor, long hours under a punishing sun, razor-sharp leaves slicing skin, backs bent until pain became permanent. Workers lived in cramped quarters, surrounded by fences and natural barriers, with no transportation, no money, and no legal power. Fear was the true currency of control, passed down through whispered warnings about what happened to men who tried to run or speak out. Although the United States was fighting fascism abroad, the same year saw these men denied basic human rights at home. Jim Crow laws ensured that black laborers had no meaningful access to courts or protection, especially in isolated agricultural regions. Plantation owners exploited this reality, knowing that complaints would be ignored or punished. Any injuries suffered in the fields were treated as personal weakness, not employer responsibility. Deaths were rarely documented, disappearances quietly absorbed into the system, because black lives were considered replaceable in an industry built on exploitation. Local communities were aware of these conditions, yet silence prevailed. Storekeepers extended credit only with plantation approval, tying survival to obedience. Sheriffs relied on plantation money and votes, making enforcement of labor laws non-existent. Churches whispered prayers but avoided confrontation. The plantation functioned as its own closed world, where authority flowed downward and questions never traveled back up. Men who entered this system learned quickly that survival depended on compliance and that speaking out invited consequences worse than exhaustion or hunger. By 1944, the plantation was less a workplace than a controlled environment designed to erase individuality. Names were replaced by numbers or nicknames, days blurred together, and hope was systematically crushed. The cane fields stretched endlessly, swallowing sound and movement, making it easy for a man to vanish without witnesses. In a place where laborers were treated as property in all but name, disappearance did not trigger alarms, investigations, or records, because the system itself was built to continue uninterrupted, regardless of who was lost, removed, or erased from the soil itself. The morning the 11 cane cutters disappeared began like any other, marked by the dull rhythm of routine that defined plantation life. Before sunrise, they were seen lining up for tools, their faces hollow with fatigue but their movements practiced and obedient. Each man carried the same machete he had used countless times before, blades nicked and darkened from years of cutting through thick cane. Overseers counted heads without looking closely, more concerned with numbers than names, unaware or unwilling to notice that this would be the last time these men were ever seen alive in daylight. By midday, the heat settled heavily over the fields, bending the air and muting distant sounds. Workers labored in scattered rows, separated by tall cane that swallowed visibility after only a few steps. Cane fields were notorious for hiding movement, turning human figures into shadows that could vanish with a single turn. Shouts rarely carried far, and any injury or conflict could unfold unseen. This isolation made the fields ideal places for violence or punishment, locations where men could be removed without witnesses and without immediate consequence. When evening arrived, the end-of-day whistle sounded, echoing across the plantation as it always had. Workers returned in small groups, dragging exhausted bodies toward their quarters. But as the sky darkened, it became clear that something was wrong. 11 men did not return. Their bunks remained empty, their food portions untouched. At first, overseers assumed delay or disobedience, expecting them to appear by nightfall. When hours passed and no movement stirred the paths between the fields and the quarters, concern turned into irritation rather than alarm. No search was organized that night. Lanterns were not carried into the cane, and dogs were not released to track missing men. Instead, the plantation gates were closed, as if sealing the land would prevent questions from entering. The next morning, the tools assigned to the missing cutters were quietly collected, stacked away as if their owners no longer existed. No notices were posted, no families informed, and no explanations offered to the remaining workers who were ordered back into the fields under threat of punishment. Within days, the disappearance was absorbed into routine. Overseers warned the remaining laborers not to ask questions, suggesting the men had been relocated or punished elsewhere. Rumors spread quietly among workers. Some spoke of shallow graves hidden beneath freshly turned soil, others of night wagons leaving the fields long after curfew. Fear kept these stories low and fragmented, passed only in whispers. The absence of the 11 men became a silent lesson, a reminder that on this plantation, people could vanish without a trace, and the world beyond the cane would never come looking. As night settled over the plantation, the air itself seemed uneasy, thick with humidity, and something harder to name. Those living nearby later claimed that the usual sounds of insects and distant river movement fell strangely out of rhythm. Crickets stopped chirping in waves, as if silenced by an approaching presence, and the wind shifted direction repeatedly, carrying echoes that did not belong to the fields. From the workers' quarters, faint voices were heard drifting from the cane, low and strained, rising briefly before being swallowed by distance. No one dared step outside to look, knowing that curiosity after dark often invited consequences worse than ignorance. Not long after midnight, dogs on neighboring land began to howl uncontrollably, their cries sharp and panicked. Animals strained against chains, pacing and whining as though reacting to something unseen moving through the fields. A few residents later swore they saw lantern lights weaving unnaturally through the tall cane, stopping suddenly, then reappearing far away, as if carried by hands that did not walk normal paths. The movements were too deliberate to be lost workers and too coordinated to be coincidence, suggesting an operation unfolding under the cover of darkness. The sounds that followed were fragmented and brief, making them easier to dismiss and harder to forget. A sharp cry cut through the night, followed by what some described as muffled shouting, quickly silenced. Metal struck metal once, perhaps a tool dropped or knocked aside, then nothing. Silence returned suddenly and completely, heavier than before, pressing down on the land. It was the kind of silence that felt imposed rather than natural, as if the plantation itself had been ordered to remain still. Those who lay awake that night remembered the fear not as panic, but as paralysis. Doors stayed shut, windows remained dark, and prayers were whispered instead of spoken aloud. No one screamed for help, not because nothing was happening, but because everyone understood what unanswered screams meant in a place ruled by authority and punishment. Even children sensed something had shifted, waking from sleep without knowing why, their instincts responding to the sudden absence of familiar noise. By morning, the plantation appeared unchanged, yet the memory of the night lingered like a stain. The cane stood undisturbed, dew clinging to leaves that hid whatever had occurred beneath them. No explanations were offered for the disturbances, and those who mentioned the noises were warned to forget what they thought they heard. Over time, the sounds became legend, retold in hushed tones as proof that the night the 11 vanished was not quiet at all, but filled with terror carefully erased by daylight and fear. When word of the missing cane cutters finally reached local authorities, it did not arrive as an urgent alarm, but as an inconvenience. The plantation owner framed the situation carefully, describing the men not as missing laborers but as transient workers who had moved on. In a time when black lives were routinely undervalued, such explanations were rarely challenged. Officials accepted verbal statements without written reports, choosing convenience over truth. No names were formally recorded, no descriptions taken, and no timeline established, allowing the disappearance to exist only as a rumor rather than a case. Sheriff deputies who briefly visited the plantation did so in daylight, escorted by overseers who controlled what could be seen and heard. They did not enter the cane fields, did not question workers privately, and did not inspect the quarters where the men had slept. Their presence felt symbolic, a performance meant to suggest concern without requiring action. Any laborers who attempted to speak were watched closely, their fear visible enough to discourage further inquiry. Silence was interpreted as confirmation that nothing was wrong. Paperwork, where it existed at all, was intentionally vague. The incident was categorized under labor disputes or workforce relocation, bureaucratic language that erased urgency and responsibility. At a time when wartime shortages created constant movement of workers, such classifications provided an easy excuse to close files before they were ever opened. Once labeled non-criminal, the disappearance required no follow-up, no state involvement, and no federal review. The system protected itself by refusing to acknowledge that a crime might have occurred. Community leaders who might have raised concerns understood the risks of doing so. Ministers, shop owners, and teachers knew that challenging plantation power could result in economic retaliation or violence. Letters went unwritten, phone calls were never made, and questions were swallowed before leaving the tongue. Even families of the missing men were discouraged from asking where their sons or husbands had gone, warned that persistence would only bring trouble to those still living nearby. Fear spread quietly, reinforcing the decision to let the matter fade. Within weeks, the disappearance of 11 men had been buried under official indifference. No investigation remained to obstruct plantation operations, no records existed to revisit, and no accountability was demanded. What should have been treated as a mass disappearance instead became an absence without consequence, a deliberate forgetting enforced by authority. The refusal to investigate did more than erase the men themselves. It ensured that whatever happened on that plantation would never be challenged, documented, or officially acknowledged as wrong. Long after the plantation stopped producing cane, the land refused to forget what had happened there. Locals spoke of an unease that settled over the fields after sundown, a heaviness in the air that made even seasoned workers uneasy. Night insects grew suddenly quiet in certain areas, and dogs refused to cross invisible boundaries, pulling back as if sensing danger beneath the soil. The ground itself seemed altered, holding secrets that no amount of time could erase. Generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, passed down in cautious tones that blurred fact and fear. Elders warned children not to wander near the old fields, claiming voices could still be heard when the wind cut through the cane stubble. Some swore that on certain nights shapes moved where no people stood, and faint cries echoed without direction or source. These stories were never told for entertainment, but as warnings rooted in lived memory rather than imagination. Occasional attempts to repurpose the land were quietly abandoned. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation, workers reported feelings of panic, and sudden illnesses were blamed on the heat, though temperatures remained mild. Construction crews left early, refusing to return after dark, citing dreams that felt too real to ignore. Each failed effort reinforced the belief that the plantation carried more than history, that it was marked by something unresolved and deeply wrong. Researchers and journalists who later attempted to uncover records found only gaps. Census lists showed men who vanished from documentation in 1944, payroll logs ended abruptly, and local newspapers offered nothing beyond brief mentions of labor shortages. The absence of information became its own evidence, suggesting deliberate erasure rather than coincidence. Every missing file pointed toward a coordinated silence that stretched beyond a single plantation, implicating an entire system invested in forgetting. Today, the story survives not in archives, but in whispers, carried by those who believe the land remembers what people tried to bury. The 11 men exist as shadows in regional folklore, symbols of lives taken without acknowledgement or justice. Their disappearance remains unsolved not because clues were lacking, but because truth was never allowed to surface, leaving behind a haunting reminder that some horrors endure not through ghosts, but through silence.